Welcome to the Republican Professor. Today we have an incredibly special guest, Dr. Alex Hindman, is joining us from the East Coast. Good to see you, Alex.
Great to be with you, Lucas. How are you?
I'm doing okay.
Good, good.
I'm in
Yeah, for sure.
California, so that answers part of the question.
Right, right.
And it's kind
So,
of ambiguous. It's an ambiguous answer because California can be quite a wonderful place in many respects, and then it can be a total disaster in other respects.
at least
We're
the
dealing with
weather's
a
though.
combination of both of those right now.
Yeah. How's the weather going though? I always loved it in the
The weather is
fall out
always
there.
great. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
it's
perfect
fine.
out there. I mean, it's paradise.
Besides when the Santa Ana winds are blowing, but that's not
Sure,
right now.
sure.
But so you're in the East Coast.
Yeah, so I'm holed up here at the College of the Holy Cross right now, in Worcester, spelled W, like almost like the sauce, like Worcestershire sauce,
Hmm.
but it's spelled Worcester
I
or
never know
pronounced
how to say
Worcester.
it. I look at it
Yeah,
and I don't know how to say it.
that's all right. That's all
It's
right.
like
It's a
Dartmouth. I mean, I remember when I first said Dartmouth sometime, and they were like, "Oh, you mean Dartmouth?"
yeah,
And I'm like, "No, I meant Dartmouth. I mean, I can
yeah.
read."
That's right. Well, they add syllables here for different cities, and so you
Do
have
they?
you have Peabody, which is Peabody, right? Because
Uh-huh.
it's Peabody, you get an extra syllable there. You
Uh-huh.
take some out, and so it's a weird thing. That's how they tell that I'm not from around here, so it works out okay.
In Tennessee, where my wife is from, they have a city called, it's spelled Milan, like in Italy. That's
Right.
not how they say it. They say Milan.
That's really
I want to go
great.
down to the Milan Arsenal and look at the cows.
It's so fantastic.
Anyway, well, how do you like teaching there?
I like it a lot. I'm fortunate that I'm in a very good department. I consider, you know, it's in a lot of ways, the academy has its challenges, of course, and in a lot of other ways, there's some good things going on. I mean, there's a whirlwind out there in a lot of environments,
Yeah.
and we're hearing about it in a lot of places. But I'm very fortunate here that um, I've got a good department that kind of takes ideas seriously,
Wow.
and that's a dying position. And so I'm quite fortunate in that regard. We have a lot of disagreements among my colleagues and I occasionally, but we usually it's based on facts, and you can surprisingly make arguments based on facts here, and people will actually listen to it. And so I
Hmm.
really like it here that way.
How
And the students are
refreshing.
decent too.
Oh, wow. Hey, I
But
like to hear that.
well, it's bimodal sometimes too. I mean, you got
Hmm.
some good students and some ones that are a little ragged, but for the
So
most
you
part, I
have some
forget them.
students that actually care about the material?
Yeah, it's really surprising. I've got a great former student. She's now writing for the Wall Street Journal and doing some stuff for the Manhattan
Wow.
Institute. So yeah, we got some good stuff happening
Manhattan
around, which is
Institute.
kind
Wow.
of cool. Yeah, so
That's
she's out
awesome.
there doing some stuff on like the Harvard case on Asian admissions and some things like that, and working on some stuff. So it's
That's
really
a
kind
hot
of
button
slick.
issue. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're not messing around. So we got some
How
good
cool.
folks here for sure. But
And is that your office that you're in now
yeah,
at
yeah.
school?
So they gave me a little bit of space to hang my hat for a little while
Mm-hmm.
longer. So
Yeah.
I took advantage of it for a little
Yeah.
bit.
You got a file cabinet. How cool is that? I
I
love those
know it's
things.
like it's old school in a way. I
I
had
would have been
two.
so excited to see that. Do you have a pencil sharpener too on the wall?
The one that you crank,
Yeah.
no, they did, but I'm actually in a room. I don't know if you can tell behind the chair over there. There's an old sink connection because I'm actually in a space that a Jesuit priest, Catholic Jesuit priest, used to be his living quarters.
Wow.
And
Oh,
now it's all been converted over. So it's kind of a neat
okay.
historical place in that way.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have a drinking fountain in there?
I do not. No, but there's one there's one right outside. So we
Okay.
got we got plenty of the old school
Okay.
stuff, the crank
Do you,
pencil sharpeners and so
now
in the
I'll know if it's
classroom.
old school if you have one of these. Do you have a coat rack or a hat thing to
Oh
put your hats on?
no, we don't have hat hooks.
Oh
That's one
man,
they
they
I
took
don't know,
that
I
out.
might have missed that.
Man, I
We
had that.
had
I had that at Cal State Northridge.
uh,
My office had a coat rack. I'm not kidding you. That's how old it. And I had a pencil sharpener on
like
the
mounted.
cranker one in my office
That's fantastic. That's
and
fantastic.
in some of the classrooms. And I just love seeing that stuff. I
That's
just
really
love it.
cool. Well, one of the
Well,
things they have these church pews in my hallway,
Oh
with
yeah.
with numbers on the sides of them
Oh yeah.
because you had assigned seats here for a long time for services and stuff.
Oh,
So it's
that's
wild.
cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. But yeah,
Well, I'm super happy for you. And I think
thank you
you
so
totally
much, George.
deserve it, especially
Appreciate
since
it.
I know what you went through to get your doctoral dissertation done on. Um, let me see. I'm trying to remember his name. Wasn't Chevy? I knew it was like some kind of a truck.
Yeah, close.
What was it? Toyota. Have we had a Toyota? No.
We're working on it. Maybe one
Uh,
day.
yeah, someday maybe.
Someday.
Who'd you do your dissertation on again?
Yeah, I love Jerry Ford. I love
Oh,
Jerry
that's
Ford.
right, Ford. That's right. It was
Yeah.
Gerald Ford.
A
Okay, yeah.
Ford, not a Lincoln, as they often say, right? He was a Ford, not a Lincoln. So
Well, now Gerald Ford, you wouldn't think that that is the sexiest topic ever
no,
for wanting to spend a good chunk of your life researching,
sure.
and you did spend a huge chunk of your life researching that. You went to the archives. How many times did you go to the
I
archives?
went to the archives. I think if I recall correctly, I think there were basically, I think there were 4 trips. There were 4 trips to the archives, about a week apiece, probably.
Wow,
In Ann Arbor, Michigan. And
that's where they are. Okay.
I stayed in Milan, Michigan, which is similar to Milan, Michigan, but I stayed at a little sleep inn, little comfort inn down the road. And so I would cart myself up to the big house where uh, University of Michigan is finding some success finally. And I would go up there, and Ford's
That's
library
funny.
is off to the side of that. And I would go in there
Oh,
and spend the day kind of going through his papers, which was cool.
wow.
Yeah.
That's probably the only Republican thing in Ann Arbor, I'm guessing.
It's like an embassy of sorts, I think,
Hmm.
in the
Good way to
middle of
put it. A consulate.
yeah, that's right. That's
It's a
right.
consulate. Say,
Interestingly though, he's the only president to split his library from his museum. So
oh,
his museum is actually in his birth city, like his hometown of Grand Rapids. So on one
ah,
side of the state they got his museum, and on the other side they have like his academic kind of papers, which is really kind of cool too.
ah,
Everybody else consolidates them
yeah.
in the same place.
Oh, okay. Okay. Gotcha. Oh, that's an interesting detail.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, so what was working? Well, let's come back to the archives.
Sure.
Totally want to come to the archives again because I did one of my dissertation research tools was archival methods, and I have a
Yeah.
special heart for people that work in archives.
Yeah, no.
But how did you come to? Well, should I ask you this? Do you like Gerald Ford?
I do. I came to like him more, actually, which is a good sign when you do some of these projects. It was one of those things that so our late friend Michael Uhlmann worked for Jerry Ford for a little while in his Justice Department.
Yeah.
And one of the things so he was our professor at Claremont, and
What was
one of
his
the things
position again?
I think he was in the Ford White
Yeah.
House. Yeah, so he was in the Ford Justice Department. He was the Assistant Attorney General
Yeah.
of Legal Policy, I think. So he was 2 rungs down from the Attorney General when he
So
was in
the
the Justice
assistant,
Department.
so there was another assistant attorney general at the same time for legislative affairs named,
There was an OLC, legislative policy was OLC was Antonin Scalia at the
I've
time.
heard of that guy.
Yeah, so yeah, he's around. He's
I've
around.
heard
He's
of
been
that
around a
guy.
little bit. You may have heard of another guy in that senior leadership staff.
There's another guy
Rob,
too.
Robert Bork was there with him.
Ah,
And then Richard Thornburg, actually, the governor of my home state of Pennsylvania, was
okay.
also there. So there was this really interesting kind of really neat synergy that Mike Uhlmann talked about with me a
Amazing.
lot during the Ford years
Yeah.
about how they felt embattled.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, what can I do that's kind of in that wheelhouse?
Now,
And that's how the
so
idea took off.
were
Yeah.
you in a Uhlmann class when a former Ford employee. Were you in, well, actually, he was a political appointee, right? He was
Yes,
confirmed by the Senate, right?
that's right.
Uhlmann
Yeah,
was, and
that's right.
Scalia. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that whole crew. And they came in about, I don't know, 4 months into the Ford administration. So it took Ford. Ford
Okay.
had another attorney general, and the late Larry Silberman, the Judge Silberman,
Hmm.
who just passed away probably like 2 weeks ago
DC
from the
Circuit.
DC Circuit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was kind of the transitional figure that helped Ford get the Justice Department kind of out of the Nixon era and into the
Uh,
Ford, and pulled all these guys together. And I think
wow.
Judge Silberman kind of gave Uhlmann and Scalia and those guys, that young kind of young
Hmm.
society of those guys, a real start.
Yeah, and then when Uhlmann went to the White House, when Reagan won,
Yeah,
um, I saw this on his. I never knew this, but
yeah,
I saw this, and I wouldn't have believed it. I would have. It would have been hard for me to believe it if I didn't see it with my own eyes. But on the YouTube of his, the James Wilson Institute put
yes,
this memorial up. I don't know if you saw that, and there was a guy in the audience that I recognized his voice, and he was Uhlmann's assistant
yes,
during that time when he worked at the White House. And the camera turns over to him, and it was then Attorney General, the current Attorney General of
yeah,
the United States,
yeah.
sitting there, William Barr. Actually, he's been Attorney General twice at the time he was, and
That's
because this was
wild.
in 2000. When was this memorial done? It would have been 2020, I believe,
Yeah, I think it was right
February or something.
before. Yeah, like right before we all
It
shut
was
down and
before
got
the
locked
shutdown.
in.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
But
and
no,
Clarence
I mean,
Thomas was there,
such a
and
weird touch.
he was prominently featured, but you couldn't miss Clarence Thomas sitting there next to Charles Kessler and Hadley Arcus.
Yeah.
But yeah, for some reason Christopher Demuth and William Barr were both sitting in the audience, and I mean, I
Surreal.
just recognized his voice, and then I was like, "Holy cow, that's the Attorney General! He's talking about my professor,"
Yeah.
and he was just
It's
an assistant at the time, just
such a wild thing.
yeah, like a paid intern kind of assistant kind of thing.
That's what I got. I got the
Yeah,
sense he also had, Yeoman mentioned he had a close connection to Josh Bolton, who was the chief of staff to George W. Bush. And so there's all these folks, and I'm surprised because, as you know, Yeoman never talked about this aspect of
I
his
know.
reach, like humility to a fault in a way. And so
It
you
actually drove
find
me
out,
nuts because I could never
yeah,
tell what I was dealing with. But
right. No, I got you. And it was one of those things like we would find out that he had these connections around. And I'm still kind of running into people that said, "Oh, you were a student of Mike Yeoman's. Oh, okay. He helped me get my job." And okay, sure. Like it's just these weird,
yeah,
weird connections that he has everywhere and stuff. But he was the one. So interesting story. One of the things I did for him was we would drive him to the airport. So one day from Claremont, it's like 4 a.m. or something like that because he had to take an early flight to get back to the East Coast. And I pitched the dissertation idea to him for Jerry Ford in the car. And this was like the fifth idea I had pitched to Mike Uhlmann. And so we're zipping across the
wow,
210 and down the 57 to go to LAX. And I start pitching this idea, and he goes, "Let me think about it," and gets on the plane. And when he landed at wherever he was, I got a call. He said, "Hindman, start working it up." And that was the genesis of it. Um, and he always said that there's stuff in the Ford administration that we had to deal with that really tested the office, like really showed, he said, that I think the constitutional structure of the thing is more durable than people want to admit sometimes. And so
wow.
that kind of started the process and started the wheels turning. And then I
Mhm.
realized I knew virtually nothing about the level of history that I needed to learn about that whole Nixon Watergate period. So then it was just sort of a deep dive into a bunch of the sources and things on that.
So the archival research, was that providing the history, or what was that providing for you?
So for me, for my purposes, right? So I used a lot of biographies initially. So because I got to get my cast of characters down of who was who, uh, just generally kind of some economic data to give a little bit of context and background. Because the weird thing about, as you know, Lucas, when you go into archives, you have these individual pieces of the story. So you find all these sort of shards of evidence around, and then you have to kind of contextualize them in the broader history. And so that was what I had to do. So the nice thing about the archives is you can find the actual paper that Ford, said, okay, I guess we're done in Saigon in the evacuation of Vietnam. And you see that actual piece of paper. So that's the cool, like, nerd fun of doing archival work.
Wow.
But before that, it's trying to get an idea of the context of that, of the
Now,
whole
did you have to
picture.
wear gloves?
I was fortunate I did not have to wear gloves. No.
Were these pieces of paper in plastic or no, actually they wouldn't have been in plastic, but what were they in?
No, it was really kind of
Folders?
open air almost. Like, it
Yeah.
was almost like I opened the filing cabinet, the ancient filing cabinet behind me.
Yeah.
I pull it open, and then,
You know,
it's most of that stuff.
I'm embarrassed that I asked if it was in plastic because I just said that I took archival research and there's no way it would have been in plastic because that stuff binds to the
Sure.
ink and destroys the document.
Well, the one thing that was cool is some of the stuff, like the really like high touch, like everyone wants to see the paper that did the pardon. So for the stuff that I was into, if you wanted to see it, that stuff's all like layered up behind all sorts of, like,
Security
preservation
stuff.
materials and
Mm,
stuff.
okay.
But the real one, so they photocopy it and then they'd put it in the stuff, and so you'd have a copy for preservation, which was kind of neat to see.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of archives. When you pitched your thing to Uhlmann on that car ride,
Sure.
did you know that you were going to have to do archival research?
I didn't quite have an idea of how it was going to go. And when I mentioned it to him, he said, "Yeah, we wrote a lot of letters back and forth. There's a lot of memos that we wrote about this." And I was like, "Well, that would be kind of good to see, right?" And his thing was, "Yeah, but they're probably in his paper somewhere or whatever. Go see what you can find." In a way, he would send me off to go hunt around. And I was fortunate enough, the Ford Library, um, it's a great operation up there, by the way. So they have their foundation is very active. And so I was able to apply, and they gave me a couple bucks. I think it was like a $2,000 travel grant or something like that, to fund my travel to get back and
You
forth
got you
and
got your
dig in.
Denny's money.
I got my Denny's money. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Cramming down a breakfast smile or whatever it is that they
Motel
used to have.
6.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And schlepping around. So I went up there,
Yeah.
and I'm a Pennsylvania guy, and so I
This
went
is
around
before
going
Uber, everybody.
before Uber.
Before
Yeah.
Lyft.
Before
How did you
they
get around? Did you
so
hitchhike?
no, I drove it because at the time
Got a rental?
I went to
Oh,
so
you
this was the
drove.
time. Yeah, I
Okay.
drove. So I was living in Buffalo at the time. And
Uh,
then so I pitched the idea to Uhlmann. Like 6 months later, it was right around the 2008 housing crash. And so I ran out of money. And so I moved in with my brother in Buffalo for a little bit. And then I drove from Buffalo to Michigan for a week at a time. And I'd go hole up in Michigan and go through the Ford stuff. Um,
wow.
but it was a lot of fun. And he's an
Yeah.
all-American athlete. So that was the crazy thing. So he
Yeah,
has
that's
this
right.
weird
He was.
football kind of connection. And so in Michigan, like, you walk into the lobby and they have his helmet and they have his jersey and they have all of this stuff from when he played. And then you kind of wheedle your way back to the back, and then you find like the legislative veto or something like that.
Oh, he went to the University of Michigan?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, he played football there.
Played, yeah, he was a center there. So he was a starting center there. For all
Okay.
4 years he was at the University of Michigan, I
Okay.
think. And then
Did
he
he ever
ended
play
up
pro?
he was offered, this was the cool thing, he was offered contracts with the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers. And he
Wow.
turned them both down to go to Yale Law School. So it's this odd
Wow.
kind of pattern with him. But they have his letters from the Detroit Lions offering him a contract and stuff. It's really kind of cool.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's cool. They kept
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, okay, I was thinking of Byron White. That's how did I get Gerald Ford mixed up with Byron White? But Byron White was I knew there was some high up guy that played professional football.
Yeah.
and he was also a lawyer, and
Yeah.
he was a decent guy from
Yeah.
all accounts.
Yeah,
Byron,
no. Byron White played for the
Byron White.
Steelers for a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whizzer White, I think was his name. But
Wow. That's
that
you don't
whole
normally see
generation of
that.
guys, that whole generation of guys are really like Renaissance guys in a lot of ways. I always feel like that
Are you,
greatest generation type,
yeah, it does have a nostalgic feeling,
Sure.
even though there's certain things about the New Deal that make me a little queasy
Me
and
too.
the Great Society. But are you a sports guy?
A little
Do you
bit.
like sports?
A
Okay.
little bit. Yeah, yeah.
So was that a major connection with Ford then, or was that just kind of like,
Well, the
take it
big
or
thing
leave
for,
it?
yeah, I mean, I like the fact that I think he's one of the most athletic presidents we've had. So for all the times they show him on like Chevy Chase bumbling out of the plane or
Mhm.
falling over or whatever, he actually, I mean, when you line up our presidents, in terms of his collegiate athletics and all of that, he was
Mhm.
actually one of the most athletic guys we've had. So
Hmm.
it's this odd kind of thing. So that did connect with me a little bit. I mean, I think the big thing for me was this is a guy who was like a suburban dad, right? He's a guy you want to have a beer with. And so you say, hey, you want to clean out my gutters? And I feel like he was like every man in a lot of ways. He was the least likely, in my view, I think, to actually want to be president. Like he didn't necessarily want to do that job initially. And so I think as a conservative, right, that's a
Yeah,
hugely important thing. It's these guys that have 10-point utopian plans to make our world a better place. When the reality of it is sometimes doing nothing is actually a decent strategy to be a good president,
that's a deep point right there.
Yeah, yeah,
I think that might be the whole theme that you just identified. I think, yeah, I think that might be a point of connection for me and other people with Gerald Ford. The
yeah,
thing I like about him the most, it's not that he played football, it's
yeah.
not even that he turned down those contracts, which is pretty
It's
impressive.
pretty cool. Yeah,
I mean, I don't know what his motivation was for going to Yale Law School, though. I
yeah,
guess that would depend on what the difference of the motivation was.
yeah.
But is it true that he did? Well, I mean, do we really have him down? What was his motivation for going to law school?
Yeah, so this is one of those things. I think it was one of the things that we talk about sometimes with our students. Like they see the law as a way to gain, I think, some financial security. And so the interesting thing about Ford's background, right, is he was born Leslie King in Omaha, Nebraska. And his father, his biological father, was an abusive father. And so his mom left, moved back with her family to Grand Rapids, and found a second husband, got married, and Ford changed his name to identify right with that being his new dad. And I think there's some element of the difficulties of his family that might have compelled him to law school, or he wanted to do law school. He was I think he wanted to practice law genuinely. Um, and so he wanted to come back to Michigan and do that. And he did for a little bit before World War II. And then, like a lot of other guys at that time, he went off and was on the USS Monterey for a little bit, where he was the physical education officer, given his background at Michigan. So there's this interesting kind of interplay in his path. But the decision to go to law school, I haven't quite been able to suss it out, but I'm kind of thinking that was in that kind of looking for financial security, looking for a career,
Okay.
in a way.
All right. Um, Now, what was the link with Congress then? How did he ever want to do that? And
Yeah, it's,
what's the sense of why he wanted to go into Congress?
yeah, who would want to do that, right? I mean, it's kind of this odd thing. I think he came back from World War II.
Okay.
And like a lot of these guys, I think he tried to practice law for a while. Uh, and the isolationism that was kind of common in Western Michigan at that time. Um, and Senator Vandenberg, right, from Michigan, had this kind of shift and change of heart where he was this really staunch, like Lindbergh isolationist before World War II. And then after World War II, they said, well, the world's new. We need some form of American global leadership. And Ford kind of always fit in that category. He kind of saw the need for American leadership and sort of the beacon of hope to being around the world. And he said, look, all these guys that are coming back, we've got to get involved. And I think that was the big that was the big impetus to convince him to try and run. But he did this kind of unique thing. There was a guy that was in the seat, and Ford did this masterful stroke of political strategy. He waited till the absolute filing deadline before he announced his candidacy to take on this incumbent. And in Western Michigan, there's a deep sort of Dutch Reformed church out there, and there's a lot of stability that comes from those folks out in Western Michigan, and so they would return incumbents on such a regular basis that they were relatively stable. And so Ford comes in and he says, you know what, this guy's a bit of an isolationist. It's time for a new blood in this, but I can't take him on too soon. And so we waited right up to the filing deadline, jumped into the race, and out hustled the incumbent in the last, whatever the distance was between the filing deadline and the primary, and he was able to unseat the current incumbent.
What was that guy's name?
Jonkman, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's
what
right.
year was that he first went to Congress?
That would have been 1940. I think it was the 48 election. I think he went in 48. I could be wrong. That I might need to fact check that one, but yeah, I think it was. I'm pretty sure it was 48. Because that would be.
So he was in. I know he was in Congress for 20 years, over 20 years.
Yeah, about 25 years in the House. Yeah, so that would line up. I think if I do.
He was the minority leader, right?
Yeah, so that's another crazy story. He had always been he got to the House and he fell in love with it. He really liked the House of Representatives. So his dream was to become Speaker. And so in working with Don Rumsfeld at the time, and this is how Rumsfeld and Ford got linked up, they took on Chuck Halleck, who was the kind of like the old guard Republican establishment guy. And Ford was the new kind of upstart insurgent and went to war with the current minority leader in the House. And I think that might have been 52 or 56, mid 50s, that Ford kind of rolled in.
What was that guy's name again?
Chuck Halleck, Halleck. And they called them the Young Turks, not like the television show, right? Or the podcast on the left, but they called these insurgent young Republicans the Young Turks. And they said, look, these guys are pre-World War II, we're the generation of the future, and this is the future of the Republican Party. And they kind of came in and unseated that old guard Republican, which really was kind of neat. So there's a fighting side of Ford, but it's always in the legislature. Like he was a legislator's legislator. And he carried some of those political practices into the White House when he later got to the White House. And it took a while essentially my argument is, it took him a while for the Constitution to kind of change his soul in a way, to change his character in a way, to make him more presidential. And so that's the whole move. And I think that kind of, in terms of sort of high constitutional theory, that's kind of the big takeaway, I think, from the Ford presidency. What made this suburban dad that everybody kind of likes, this 25-year congressman, into a moderately decent president? And that's kind of the big story. But it's really kind of cool when you stand back and you think about just his formation was in Washington, but not in the executive branch. And he was Nixon's safe pick. Like no one thought that Jerry Ford would be the guy, but it sort of shifted in and became the crowning achievement, I think, in some way, of the Nixon presidency. That is ultimately what saved, I think, the country after Watergate. I think we would have been in a much worse place without him. Oops, I lost you there, Lucas.
Yeah, sorry, I had it on mute.
Oh, that's okay. Gotcha.
Thanks for telling me.
Yeah, for sure.
Happens all the time.
It's okay.
So I pulled up the book on YouTube for everybody. Obviously, if you're watching on YouTube, you don't need me to tell you that. But everybody else on audio only, I'm looking at the book right now. It's called Gerald Ford and the Separation of Powers. And I was prompted to pull it up because of what you said about his soul changing when he changed
Yeah.
institutions. I'm a big fan of separation of powers, and I
Sure.
guess you are too, right?
I think it's the crowning piece of our constitutional system.
Wow.
I think at the end of the day, that's all that keeps us from losing our freedom, right? I mean,
Right.
it's one thing to say, like we have every country in the world has a Bill of Rights where they list all these things out. And the only thing that keeps it kind of from going off the rails is if we have that tension that exists between disparate power centers fighting one another. And the thing about Ford, and the thing I like about Ford, and where he doesn't get enough credit, and I don't think he was even self-conscious of it in the way he needed to be, perhaps. But he, I think, saved the idea that a president could tell Congress no. That a president could stand up to Congress and say, you know what, I don't think you're doing the right thing here.
And
That
that's
you,
because a, a lot of people think, well, maybe you should fill it in for us a little bit, because the people who are there don't maybe need to be reminded, but actually a lot
sure,
of them maybe do need to be reminded of just what it was like.
yeah,
And during that time, it was so the Nixon era with Vietnam and everything, that was so caustic and
yeah,
divided. And Nixon, of course, didn't help anything at all.
yeah, yeah, not at the
Although I
end.
think people are more harder on him than maybe they should be on
I
some
agree.
things.
I agree. I think when you
Yeah,
stand back,
yeah.
Nixon is the dominant figure of the last sort of, I don't know, because it's 50 years. If you were to look at the 50-year period from the end of World War II until his fall, and maybe even into the 90s before his death, right? He's the dominant figure in American politics, second only maybe to the Kennedy family in an odd way, right? This kind of,
Very awkward.
I know it's a weird thing, much more awkward in a lot of ways, but he was always kind of looming there from the
Right.
McCarthy era stuff and
That's
his
right.
investigation on HUAC and all of that. And he is a candidate for president in 1960. And then there were always the questions of will he run, will he not run, what's going to happen to him. He was always right around that outside piece, and I always felt he got a bit of a raw deal.
I do
Um,
too. I can
it's just
understand why he was
rough.
so paranoid because of what he
Yeah,
was dealing with. I mean,
sure.
I from what I understood, if you listen to the debate with him and Kennedy, the people who listened thought he won,
Yeah,
but the people who watched it thought Kennedy won because they had to actually see Nixon's face and
yeah,
see him sweating.
yeah. I mean, this is the crazy thing. There was a substantive guy. I mean, this is the Nixon too. People forget there was a Checkers speech where Nixon really was one of the first political actors to really get behind television. So there was a bit of a scandal right around the time of Eisenhower when Eisenhower had picked him as vice president. And so there was serious talk in the Eisenhower administration of dropping Nixon from the ticket, find somebody else who doesn't have kind of this question about how he had campaign finance at the time. And Nixon buys an hour on television, like you could do that, right? He
Hmm.
goes on and he talks about, you know what, and my little dog Checkers over here, he'll write, and it's this whole like visual kind of thing. So the fact that he drops the ball in 60 on the debate and kind of
Hmm.
sweating and not quite put together right visually, but still whip smart substantively, he really got hung up in that Camelot kind of machine that was
That's
trying
interesting.
to construct around the Kennedys, like Kennedy's, like selling Kennedy like high fashion or something like that.
Yeah,
So
I knew that Eisenhower had second thoughts and didn't particularly like him, but I didn't know that he bought an hour of TV
I think it was like
to,
to make his
wow,
case in a way. Yeah.
wow.
He brought his dog and he talked about his
Yeah,
dog, I think. And so it was this weird kind of hokey
yeah.
thing. And
That's very
Eisenhower
hokey.
was furious, but he couldn't do
Yeah,
anything about it
yeah.
because it galvanized the Republican base.
Gotcha. Yeah. Hmm. Okay. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but yeah. Well, he was um didn't he run for Nixon? He didn't he run for off he ran for governor of California, I think, in 1962. Is that
I think
right?
that's right. He tried to
He lost.
rehabilitate his, yeah, he
Yeah,
tried to rehabilitate his stuff. And
obviously.
that wilderness years was a little tough on him from what I gathered too. Like yeah.
Next thing you know, he's an attorney, I think, in New York or something, and he's in New York of all places. When
Building.
Reagan won, Reagan took over instead in California. Well, so that era of the 70s, the early 70s, Nixon, for those of you who don't recall, of course, I don't recall, I wasn't born there, but I do remember reading it and
Sure.
just being amazed. Just sit in this for a second. When maybe we go back to Lyndon Johnson.
Sure.
Lyndon Johnson takes over because of the death of a president.
Right.
And then you got the Civil Rights Act and stuff, and he's kind of flipping on the Democrats and turning the Southern Democrats, at least starting to turn the party a bit.
Yeah.
And he was a Southerner himself, so he had some credibility, I guess, with some people.
Yeah.
And he's so popular, he easily wins in 64. I mean, it's just a nightmare election
Yes.
for Goldwater. I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of like Goldwater, but
Right.
but he got
Right.
killed. I mean,
Yeah.
Goldwater got totally demolished.
And
And
some of that, right, was the legacy of the Kennedy family. I mean, some of that is the death of a president a year
yes,
before. And so that,
yes,
Goldwater might have got caught up in
sure.
some of that too, I think. But anyway, yeah,
Well, and
sorry.
I think it's still kind of hard to explain. I've got students who go, "Yeah, he voted against the Civil Rights Act, and he did not support it." But it's hard to explain to somebody that has a very low attention span why that is, because he had principled constitutional reasons for opposing it.
Yeah.
He might have been lined up temporarily with some Democrats that didn't like it for other reasons,
Right. Right.
but those Democrats might have had constitutional reasons too. But they also had other reasons.
Yeah.
But Goldwater is not like the most waspy name you've ever heard in your whole life. And
Right.
once you start digging into it a little bit,
Right.
you realize
Right.
he desegregated the Arizona National Guard. He's got a Jewish background. He had a black female chief of staff. This is not like the carrying card of the Ku Klux Klan exactly.
Right.
And any case, he gets killed, and not killed literally, but he gets wiped out in the election.
Yeah.
But then LBJ, I mean, you would have think that this guy's unstoppable, and then just a few years later, he is
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. No, it's
And
wild.
then who comes out of nowhere? Nixon. Nixon
Pretty,
comes back.
pretty crazy.
And in 72, do you recall what the wipeout was for
It
the
was
Republic?
it was a significant piece. I want to say that McGovern ran against Nixon in 72 and only won two states, I think. I think that that's correct. I think that he only
Yeah.
won two states. Like it's an amazing landslide. However,
It's
they figured it
yeah,
out for Nixon in 72. It's remarkable, right?
right.
Um,
Yeah, he wins California.
yeah,
He wins, I think he won Hawaii.
yeah.
He won I don't think he won Massachusetts.
I don't remember. Massachusetts was a little bit more moderate at that period of time. I'd have to look that too, but
Maybe
I
it was
think it
Rhode
was,
Island. Maybe it was one
yeah,
of those
maybe that
New
was right.
England states, I think.
Yeah,
I don't remember. You could look it up, but we
yeah,
could
yeah.
look it up. But you would think he was unstoppable,
Stoppable. That's right.
and then just it's like you sneezed and he's on the ropes.
Yeah, and the as Watergate came out, it's such a weird period of time, right? So from 1960 to 1980, you never had one president. You didn't have a president that completed two terms in office. You did not have a single president between 1960 and 1980 that completed two full terms, right? Because you had Lyndon Johnson that came in, and so he was in a spot, right? So he finished out Kennedy's term, did his own term, but then didn't stand for reelection in 68. And then you had Nixon, who comes in and doesn't finish his term with the Watergate stuff. So it's this weird piece, right? So you have this whole kind of collapse in 72. Nixon looked like he was flying high. And like you said, all of a sudden, he has this catastrophic, sort of tragic fall. And it's because he has this kind of paranoia. I do think he had some real doubts. He always had that. We talk about imposter syndrome today in a way. He was always envious of people from the East Coast. And he went to Duke, and he sort of went to Duke, and he always felt bad that it wasn't one of the Ivy Leagues. And he came from Yorba Linda, right? And so he had this Whittier kind of Southern California connection. And at the time, I mean, Southern California is like one of the great sort of metropolises of the world now in a way. But at the time, like he had this deep sense of inferiority relative to these guys on the East Coast. And I think that paranoia carried throughout Nixon's life. And so when it came time to be fearful in 72, even when he didn't have necessarily reasons to believe that he was terribly vulnerable, he engaged in activities because he saw a lot. He was skeptical of everybody and sort of nervous all the time. And I think that led people around him to read that nervousness in a way that would make them take actions that ultimately turned out to be illegal in the case of the Watergate break-in and some of the other activities of the plumbers. But the fact that Nixon wasn't got on actually authorizing it, he was got sort of for the impeachment on the fact that he sort of tried to cover it up. And sometimes people lose sight of that, right? It was the fear he had of being caught that got him kind of in trouble. So 72, right?
Right. Yeah.
He does that thing, right? And then for the whole next
Crazy.
2 years, there's this slow drip of Watergate. And he never comes out and comes clean, but he claims he doesn't have anything to hide. And a lot of Republicans around him are saying, Mr. Nixon, if you have nothing to hide, then come clean about it. Let's see all the tapes. Let's see what it is.
No kidding.
And Ford said, I wanted to trust him. I took his word. And then eventually in sort of mid 74, right? The tapes come out, the decision of the Supreme Court to release the unredacted version to Watergate's special prosecutors. And then once that happened, Nixon knew he was had, and the dominoes started to fall a lot more rapidly. But that Watergate period, people don't realize, like, so there's Watergate, but we also have the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression during that period. So finally, Europe and Asia are starting to come back online. And so our production advantage in sort of the economy starting to go. I mean, we're in a weird spot, but between March of 1974 and December of 1974, right before Ford took office, the Dow Jones lost 37% of its value. Like there was just this plummet. Oil between October of 1973 and early 1974 rose from I mean, it's crazy when we think about gas prices now, right? But oil per barrel at the time, at the start in October of 73, was $1.77 a barrel. $1.77 a barrel. And by the end of it, by early 74, it was $10. So you have this massive increase in the price of oil. And a lot of Americans are hurting and they feel like their government's collapsing because of Nixon's problems, right? And Vietnam is sort of in this kind of limbo where we have combat troops out, but we're not fully out yet. And so is there always a fear we'll have to go back in? And so Americans, their heads are all spinning during this period. And that part is lost on modern Americans. Like we feel we have it rough and we're at each other's throats in a lot of ways. But there was a really similar kind of period there where, you know, the economy's in the tank. There's a lot of foreign policy challenges, right? And we got this questionable governance from Washington that we didn't quite know what to do with.
Wow.
It's a really weird period.
Sounds like a worse period than most people remember growing up.
Yeah, I asked my mom about it. She goes, I was in college. I was trying to get out of college, right? And so she wasn't thinking about it in the same way that, you know.
But she remembers gas lines maybe, and she remembers like I remember asking where I didn't ask him, but Bissett, one of our professors, said what his interest rate was for his first mortgage, and it was in the double digits.
Yeah, it's like 12%.
Insane.
Like crazy.
I can't even imagine. taking a home loan out for
Really, right?
that kind of
Yeah.
I just don't get it. But
Blows my mind, actually. Yeah.
yeah. So this is intense.
Sure.
And you have the institution of the presidency. You got the institution of Congress. Would
Yep.
you say that Congress during this time is growing in power, or
So,
and then the presidency is waning, or
sure.
how would you put it?
Yeah, so it's a weird thing. So this is one of the things, as you know, Lucas, when we try to weigh sort of dimensions. So there's two parts to this, right? Constitutionally, the powers, the nice thing about this is the powers of both branches generally, with some minor exceptions, have never really changed, right? So 1787 to now, we don't really have a lot of change in terms of the actual formal powers. Now, how we view these institutions is wildly fluctuating. And so I think you're dead right. The presidency is now at its weakest point politically, right? Watergate pretty much tarnished it. The press played a large part in this, convincing everybody that it's a systemic problem, as we hear about often, right? This is a systemic problem with the presidency, and therefore we need to reform it. And so Congress comes in as the natural sort of antithesis of the presidency. And they're like, you know what? Richard Nixon was a bad guy. We're going to prevent every other president from being a bad guy in the future. And so they roll in on a white horse, thinking that they're on a white horse, and we're going to reform everything. We're going to find all the corruption. We're going to write laws that'll prevent bad moral character, right? And that never works out, right? That never works out. And Congress thought they could do it. And Ford, to his credit, throughout his presidency, kind of held the line on that. So yeah, presidency kind of contracted,
Now, do
Congress
you think
big, right?
okay, do you think that Ford was on that bandwagon of we're going to make the presidency good again or something?
Yeah, yeah. So the neat thing about Ford, right? So he comes in, he after so after the 72 election, in October of 73, literally the same month as the Saturday Night Massacre, Spiro Agnew had left and Ford is appointed to take over as Nixon's vice president. So for the year when Watergate is really starting to collapse, from October of 73 to the time Ford takes office in August of 74, Ford's now part of the Nixon administration as his new vice president. He gets there just as Watergate's starting to implode.
So the
Um,
Saturday Night Massacre, tell everybody what that is.
sure. So the Saturday Night Massacre in October of 73 was when uh, Nixon decided he wanted to fire the special prosecutor that was investigating the Watergate break-in, Archibald Cox.
Yeah.
And so he goes through and he calls up his attorney general and says, listen, I need you to fire the special prosecutor. The attorney general refuses, resigns. They go to the next guy on the list at the Justice Department, says, listen, fire Archibald Cox. He refuses. He resigns. The next guy in line is Robert Bork. And Robert Bork says, I'm afraid Nixon is just going to continue to go down the call list for the judiciary.
Yeah.
I'll fire Archibald Cox and take that hit to save Nixon from going down through that tear. And so that's what happens. It's when Watergate really blows up because the public, so Ford gets appointed, and then the public all of a sudden realizes, holy man, if Nixon's reacting like this, there must be something to this. Why would he do this to himself?
Right.
And so now Ford is riding that wave of trying to figure out what's going on. Incidentally, the War Powers Resolution is passed in the same month, and the Arab-Israeli oil crisis is all happening in that month of October of 73. So it's a really tumultuous month. And so Ford comes in there, and so Ford's kind of committed to become the vice president, but it may be a job he didn't want to have, you know?
Yeah,
weird.
but do you think that Ford ever thought that that Congress can help the president be moral?
Yeah, that's a great question.
To just put it really crudely.
Yeah,
Basically what I'm asking you is, was Ford an idiot?
right, yeah,
Which
it was a bit of a bumbler initially, right? But the idea, I think the one
Was he
thing
naive in that sense?
I think he was. I think he was initially. I
Okay.
think a lot of his presidency, he talked about when he started coming in, he wanted to have a good marriage with Congress, right? He wanted to get along. He wanted to paper over the differences.
Yeah.
And symbolically, I
Very
think that's the right
Midwestern.
gesture, right? It's a good gesture. But then he quickly found that they're not constitutionally his friend, right? The separation of powers matters. These guys think like congressmen. I'm supposed to think like a president. And that means we're going to come to blows occasionally. It's not going to be a great marriage, but it's
Yeah.
going to be one of contention and disagreement. And I think he brought that into the office.
So that initially he had this kind of conciliatory feeling about it. Good, everybody's like kissy kissy,
Yeah,
huggy huggy.
right.
Yeah, we're colleagues.
Yeah, we love each other. It's
Um,
fine. Yeah.
and how long do you think it took before it was like, well, we're former colleagues, and I'm over here and you're over there?
Yeah, it came pretty quick. I think they were always personally, I think he
Days,
made,
weeks? What do you think?
well, yeah.
Hours?
So the pardon came a month in to Ford's term. So
Okay,
Ford
so
came
that's
in
weeks.
August, and that's like 4 weeks. So Ford wakes up on a Sunday morning
Mm,
and goes to church,
mm,
comes out of church, walks over to the White House, has asked for national TV time,
mhm.
and announces a pardon of Richard Nixon. And
Wow, that's interesting.
none of the other co-conspirators, but there was no like PR op on the front end of this. So Americans literally weren't prepped for the idea that the president Ford would pardon Nixon, and so it hit like a ton of bricks. Like
Yeah,
it brought all of that old Watergate stuff back. Ford comes into office, has like 70% approval rating. Like the public loves him.
yeah.
And then overnight he sheds like 30 odd points off the Gallup poll.
He
It's the
had to know. He had
largest
to know that was going
overnight.
to happen.
Yeah, I think he knew he was going to take a hit. But this is the nice thing about the presidency, as you know, Lucas, too. Like presidents are invested with the Constitution to give them a platform to do things that we want them to do, but we might not think they got right, like an
Right.
unpopular decision. And I
Yeah.
think he
Sure.
embraced that. He said, "Look, we can't have a president in the docks, right, in a courtroom."
Right.
And
Federalist
Nixon,
71 has a great, is it 71 that has that famous quote from Hamilton where he says that he's talking about the 4-year term and kind of how it insulates the
yeah,
president from popular opinion, passions
yeah,
of the moment, people that want
yeah,
your
the
approval
flatterers.
rather than deserve your approval. He said it so
Yeah,
much better than that, but
yeah, no, there's that
um,
section. I think it's the servile pliancy section, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah. Servile
flatterers
approval.
that'll
Yeah, that's
come.
right.
Yeah, there's flatterers that'll come and
I think that's
convince you that
71.
they're
Yeah.
on your side, and then all of a sudden, that's
So
not exactly what we want a president to do, right? We want a president to do the right thing, not the popular thing. Um,
yeah. Um, well, it seems like we want him to do both because
yeah,
we want him to be representative of us.
sure.
We don't want him to turn get elected and then just surprise everybody with what he thinks is right, which doesn't seem to be why everybody voted for him, I guess.
Yeah,
Now, okay, so this is helpful for me because I'm trying to get my handle on Ford a bit,
sure.
and we have a sense of the times, and they just were crazy.
Yeah, it was really rough.
And I love how you set that up about the pardon. He goes to church.
Yeah.
It's on a Sunday. Do you think that had something to do with his decision?
Huge, huge for him. And there's actually a minister that talked to him and talks about how forgiveness was the theme, right?
Oh,
And so the idea of national forgiveness. And yeah, Nixon did some bad stuff. And I think Ford, I mean,
interesting to have the sermon notes from that day. If that's in
oh,
the
it'd be
archives,
great.
probably not, but
It would be great to
the
see.
sermon message.
Yeah, that would be neat to know what they talked about that day.
What
Yeah.
church? What church was that?
I think it was the one across the street. I think it was the first that was that historic church that Adams was at. I think he went right across the street to the yellow church. I can see it and I can't think of the name of it right now. It's the yellow church across from Lafayette Square there. I believe that's where he had gone.
And
Um,
what was his? He was Protestant.
yeah, he was a Protestant. I think he was in that. I think it was an Episcopalian church. I think I could be wrong on this, Lucas.
Okay.
You might have to check that out. But
Well, he wasn't one of these 700 Club kind of Christians where he
no,
was tuning into, well, I guess he kind of was like a focus on the family kind of a person, but that was before focus on the family.
right.
But he wasn't one of these holy rollers, I guess.
It was subtle. It was a subtle, stable kind of faith in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Midwestern. I mean, when you
That's
think
right.
of a Midwestern, very polite, very
Yeah.
nice people.
Right.
They would, if your car broke down, they would give you a hand,
Yeah.
but they're not going to try to convert you and get you to come to Jesus as they're doing that. It's
Yeah.
not
It
like one of
wasn't
those.
Campus Crusade or something like that.
No, no,
It
right.
was a different
Gotcha.
kind of old mainline kind of style.
Okay. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
helpful. So and you believe he believed in God?
Oh yeah, no, I think that's pretty clear. Well, he was sworn in
Okay.
on Ecclesiastes, a time to heal. That line from Ecclesiastes, a
Okay.
time to heal. And he was very much, if you look at his speeches, all through his speeches, they're all infused with kind of this um, really deep references to Christianity. And there's actually some coded language like that would, so what we call coded language in political science, where there's biblical references in the diction, right?
Mm-hmm.
That one would hear and it would resonate almost Lincolnian in some sense about where Bible references kind of appear in his speeches in subtle ways, which is kind of
Do you
very
have an
cool.
example that we can kind of
Yeah, no, I
grasp?
should pull that up. I'm pretty sure when you look at the pardon message, I think the pardon message has a lot of that forgiveness, that conversation about forgiveness at the end. His inaugural, pseudo inaugural, right, where his first speech to uh when he's president, when he's sworn in, um, I'm beholden to one woman, to God, and to one woman, right? And there's these references to his marriage and Betty Ford and this really deep kind of familial family connection that he has.
Wow.
Um, and so it's subtle. Now it's pre sort of religious right, sort of Dobson 700 kind of the political activism that came to animate in the late 80s, like the late 70s, early 80s, that kind
Mm-hmm.
of brought Ronald Reagan in a different kind of
Yeah.
relationship there. Um, but it was still very much kind of part of who Ford was. And
Yeah.
it didn't have so abortion rights for Ford, right? His wife was notoriously kind of on the pro ERA, pro kind of abortion side of things. And Ford was sort of
Really?
straddling that coming division that was going to happen in the Republican Party
Hmm.
between sort of the old Rockefeller Republicans and what
Yeah.
would become the pro-life folks. And that was one thing he kind of stitched very closely, but it's hard to say where he came down directly on that issue.
Rockefeller, where was he in relation to Ford as far as did Ford disagree with Rockefeller on things?
So this is the funny thing. It's hard to suss out exactly where Ford was. Ford was kind of the middle ground candidate between the Ronald Reagan conservative California Republicans
Mm-hmm.
and the New York Nelson Rockefeller kind of
His vice
Wall Street.
president.
That's right. And then there
His
was a
vice president.
competition when Ford becomes president, the vice presidency opens up. And then you have to pick a new vice president, like Nixon had to do for Ford. And Nelson Rockefeller's on the short list and Ronald Reagan's on the short list. And Ford picked Rocky over Reagan. And it would have been a unique kind of arrangement. And one wonders whether Reagan would have come about had he been sucked into the sort of that post-Watergate Ford malaise thing
Yeah.
that Ford had to wrestle with. So there's some weird factors that move in different ways. But I think Ford he's definitely more left-leaning than
Yeah.
what Ronald Reagan had become later on. But the party was moving underneath him a little bit. So that
Okay.
was
Well, sometimes I just wonder if he was just like a squishy middle kind of a guy. Like I don't think of him as left per se, but just one of these people that the left people would take advantage of because he's so mushy in the middle. Kind of like, okay,
agreeable. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, this is my intuition. I mean, it's not based on any archival research or anything like that, but my feeling is that Reagan, okay, Reagan is in California, right? The
Right.
Democrats in California are a different kind of breed, I think, than
I think
the
that's right.
Midwestern Democrats. And so when you're getting along with people in the Midwest, there is this gentle feeling, I guess. I
Yeah,
don't know if
sure.
how I'd say it. I mean, just
Yeah.
there's just a decency, and it might be just that it's kind of the outer edges of the so-called cutting edge Democrat Party. It definitely wouldn't have been in Grand Rapids, the Democrat Party. It wouldn't have been in
No.
maybe even maybe parts of Detroit, maybe, or maybe Ann Arbor, maybe,
Yeah.
but not
But not in
not
the
like it
but not in the
was.
Berkeley kind of,
No, not
yeah,
in the
People's
like it
Park
was in the
stuff
Bay
that Reagan
Area.
had. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I
not
think
like it
that's
was
right.
in
I
like
think that's right.
probably some parts of the East Coast, like New York and Boston, maybe. But
I think that's true.
yeah, so I think it depends on the other side. Like, what kind of person are you used to dealing with on the other side? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing. He was,
No, no, I think that's right.
so I think Reagan was a little bit more, and Nixon too, I think, a little bit more on edge. I don't get the sense that Eisenhower was really on edge about anything. I mean, but he was like a Kansas guy, and his street
I
cred
think
was
that's there's
was
sort of a
legit.
chill kind of thing that these guys. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
he had street cred. Like, I mean, who, is there any question about what I've done in my life, Eisenhower? But if, these scrappy people, like even Trump, and look where he's from. He's from
Sure.
New York. The Democrats are crazy in New York. They are insane,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so that's his
No.
milieu. And he's kind of, I think like that. And
It makes
so,
them harder, I think. If you have to fight off that, I think it makes you a
yeah,
stronger kind of, you know
you know,
what you stand for and what you
and,
don't stand for, I think.
yeah, on the
Yeah.
other side, Bill Clinton. I mean, I
Sure.
don't think of Bill Clinton as a radical, insane guy. I mean, I don't like a lot of his policies. I
Sure.
don't like that, he signed the assault weapon ban, for example, but he's from Arkansas. And so, I think he would, that was his background. I mean, he's probably totally corrupt, but, like,
Yeah, yeah, no, there's
but
that
still,
part
like,
of it too. Right.
he wasn't he was not one of these Berkeley people, and
I think that's right. I
and
think that's right.
Carter too, Georgia.
Huh.
So you have,
It was a less ideologically divided country, I think, in a lot of places. In a way, we've
yeah,
become more ideologically divided. And so there were folks that were reasonable candidates that you could
yeah,
approach,
that's good.
right? But at the same time, though, what do you stand for, right? And
Right.
so I think Reagan brought something in, and particularly in facing down the Soviets, right? This was
Okay.
one thing
Yeah.
that Ford was definitely
Yeah.
on the détente side of that
Okay.
debate, right? This kind of let's try to live and let live with the Soviets.
What did
And one of the
Ford?
things that really,
Okay.
sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead, Lucas. I didn't mean,
No, no, no. He's on the détente side. Yeah, definitely. So that, I guess
yeah.
someone
So
like Jackson would have been out ahead of him, like Senator Jackson, Scoop Jackson.
yeah, Scoop Jackson was the Democrat from Washington State was very much kind of coming after Henry Kissinger, right? So Ford
Hmm.
kept Nixon's Secretary of State for continuity in the foreign policy realm, but it was all of this kind of live and let live. And Scoop Jackson, Ronald Reagan, other folks were starting to raise that new neocon kind of argument. We're
Yeah.
starting to raise points that Ford didn't, in my view, didn't really
Hmm.
have a good answer to in a lot of ways. And I think
Yeah.
it's one of those it's one of those moments where if you believe that the Soviets are here forever, we can't fight them forever, right? We've got
Right.
to kind of work out some sort of deal, and that might
Yeah.
reflect back to your point that Midwestern,
Right.
collegiality thing.
Yeah. That's right.
Um,
Yeah. It's interesting. Oh, of course, getting out of Vietnam like we did with our tail between our legs, it's kind of hard to not be détente on that point. What do
right.
you
I
think
think
that Ford thought about what Nixon did with China.
I think he was generally supportive. Ford really being a congressman from Western Michigan, I don't think Ford had a really self-driven kind of, foreign policy when he came in. He largely relied on Kissinger in a lot of ways. And so because Kissinger was the architect of sort of the Paris Peace Accords in Vietnam and kind of winding it down, I think Ford just saw the utility of that and slid in. And similarly, because China and North Vietnam had such a close relationship on the communist issue, I think all of those pieces, I mean, I wish I was a better scholar of sort of Kissinger, but all of those pieces, I think, tie together. So we show the Chinese that we're decent people through the opening, right? And therefore, we can use their influence to reduce pressure on our guys in Vietnam. And so I think there was some strategic calculations that might have happened there, and Ford was all behind that. Now, it's interesting, though, like the fall of Vietnam, and then we find out in summer of 75, the Mayaguez, so this freighter that's
I was
off the
going to
coast
ask you
of,
about that.
yeah, off the coast of Cambodia, right? It gets taken over by a bunch of communists at the behest of the Chinese and the North Koreans and possibly the Soviets. So we have new intelligence that shows that they were like, let's see if America's serious about operating in South China. And Kissinger comes out and says, yeah, we had to run off kind of cowardly from Vietnam, but understand that we need to show the world that just because we left here, we're not some paper tiger that's just going to collapse. And he said, so they ordered like the JCS, the Joint Chiefs, come to Ford, and they have a whole list of options and said, Ford's pretty much like, let's do them all. Let's show these guys that we mean business. And
Yeah,
so it was interesting
I'm
that side of
struggling
it.
to remember that episode. I know it was in Richard Pius's book, Why Presidents Fail. Did you ever
Yeah.
read that book? I'm going to
I
pull it
don't
up.
think I have. No, actually. Yeah, I don't think I have.
I'm going to pull it up.
Okay.
Means I have to
So
leave your book here for a second. But
that's okay. No, no worries.
Richard Pius wrote a book called Why Presidents Fail. And let me see if I can share my screen again for those of you watching. Here we go. And let's do hardcover. Actually, Uhlmann required this book for us.
Oh, did he? That was in your cycle for him?
Modern Presidency. Yeah. The book the class I took from him called The Modern Presidency. And let's see here. It looks like my screen is frozen. Oh, there we go. Well, maybe not. Try this again here. Well, I'm trying to show the table of contents because maybe I just refresh it here.
Yeah, Richard Pius is a great scholar of sort of the American presidency. There's another book he had. I think it's Constitution, might be the Constitution in Wartime or something like that. I think he kind of makes. I think that's Richard Pius. He makes some good. There's a whole host of stuff. It's a really good if you're into institutional presidency questions. Any of his stuff is actually really solid. So it's interesting. I hadn't been familiar with that one.
Well, he's got a chapter on the Mayaguez incident, but he doesn't have a chapter on Nixon, which is hilarious. I mean, it's just like really it's one of those things where he starts from Eisenhower. He doesn't start with anybody else. He starts with Eisenhower and he goes up to George Bush, but he leaves out Nixon. It's kind of funny. I guess he didn't want to.
That's kind of weird.
But he has that Mayaguez incident, and I forget what he says about it, to be honest with you. But is that considered a failure on his part for Ford's by scholars?
I would disagree with the idea that it's a failure, right? I think this is the reaffirmation. Yeah, I think this is the reaffirmation that the commander-in-chief power means something, right?
Okay.
You're not simply a clerk of Congress. And so there's this whole episode where Ford comes out of Vietnam in April, right? And it happens over the Easter recess. So members of Congress, as Saigon is falling, members of Congress are spread out all over the country. And Ford, we have the call sheets in the archives of where he had his staff try and hunt down and find leading members of Congress to consult them, because you have this war powers resolution now on the books. And
Right.
Ford has to authorize US troops to help get our embassy staff and, Vietnamese folks that helped us out, get them out.
Right.
And so he's calling the phone on these guys, and they're not returning his call. Like, they're not actually talking to him. He's like, Jerry, whatever you want. Yeah, you knock yourself out, right? Go ahead and do it. And Ford says, this is stupid. Why am I wasting my breath trying to
Right.
talk with these people when the Constitution gives me the power to do it, right?
Yeah.
So he gets to the
There you
Mayaguez
go.
thing, and now he's like, well, we're just going to do it, and we'll let Congress figure out what they're going to.
Did you
what
see
they're gonna do.
papers in the archives that confirm what you just said?
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff in the archive. So there's a transcript. The big one was a
Okay.
transcript that's in the archives of a meeting Ford had with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which was the sort of committee of jurisdiction for dealing with advising the president about how he should conduct foreign policy. Ford calls all these senators in, and the late Robert Byrd from West Virginia, who had his own sort of political ambitions at the time, he raises a question. He goes, let me respectfully press this. I know you're doing what you think best, and I certainly don't question your authority to do it, but I want to know why the leaders were not brought in. Why didn't you bring us in to talk about this? And Ford said, I have a right to protect American citizens. And he invokes the Constitution. He goes, it's my constitutional responsibility to command forces that can protect Americans. And so this is in Ford's own words, and the transcription from the meeting is very clear. But
That's
here's
nice.
where you see
Okay,
Ford
that's the kind of
just,
stuff in the archives that you like to see,
oh, it's like the best day, Lucas.
especially
Like, you
when he
have
quotes
that
the
day.
Constitution, and then you're like,
Oh, like,
"Booyah! What's up? What's
it's
up?"
like a dream. It's like a dream, because you're
What did
sitting
he
in
what did he
some,
quote? What was the clause? Was it multiple clauses? Was it the commander in chief clause? Was it the vesting clause?
yeah. So in all of these cases, so there's a lot of boilerplate language that comes out in the actual materials, right? So the actual notice to Congress always claims Constitution of the United, my power is under the Constitution of the United States and the laws of the United States,
Okay.
namely Commander in Chief power, Take Care Clause, and others depending on the particular, like the right to appoint ambassadors. So they have these boilerplate lines that they trot out. But what was really cool in the archives is you see how Ford not only just lets his lawyers write that stuff, but he actually kind of puts it in his own words.
Hmm.
And that part of it is really, really cool. I
Now,
can send you if you
how were
want.
you able to see that he put it into his own words? You
So in the
got so
veto,
used to
so
his voice that you could tell?
yeah, or I have direct quotations in transcripts of his public remarks. And so
Oh,
you'll see these claims where he says, sort of, there's the overt ones like this line, it's my constitutional responsibility to command the
yeah,
forces.
yeah. That's not
But then other,
boilerplate. Yeah.
yeah, it's
A
not
lawyer
boilerplate.
wouldn't have
And he
said that.
actually,
Yeah.
no, not that way. And he actually embraces it. But
Interesting.
the best one I found, Lucas, was in his own handwriting. And I
Oh, there you
asked the
go.
archivist,
That's the good stuff right
that's the
there.
really good stuff. And so in one of
Okay.
the press books, so they're prepping him up for the press
Mm-hmm.
briefings that he has to give,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all about the veto.
Mm-hmm.
And so he literally says, the same Constitution that gives Congress the power to override my veto gives me the power to issue the veto in the first place. So if you're claiming you can dictate where you get your powers from in the Constitution, I have it too. And it was just that way of selling that constitutionalism. We don't hear presidents do that anymore, but he
Mm.
has this way of embodying kind of like everything you and I studied in terms of like the Federalist
Yeah.
Papers, but bringing
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
in a way that fits people where they are. And that's the kind of stuff that made me say, this guy isn't just a suburban dad. This guy's actually like a believer in what we've got going
Yeah.
on. And
So
that
the
was so cool.
presidency, the job transformed him by helping him pay attention to what was already there that he already
That's
liked.
right.
And
Yeah.
he had the disposition to be faithful to it because he was liking a constitutional kind of a guy. He liked the Constitution, but he didn't really probably pay attention to that language as much as when he was a congressman.
I think that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's human nature. I would say that's human nature.
And I think for somebody that's used to being like a politician, right? You're not going to let me dig out my Federalist Papers. It's not like what we do every day, right? To profess things, to people. But the fact that he brought it into the policy debates of his day and packaged it in a way that defended American constitutionalism in a way that, like your average Joe on the street says, yeah, I think Jerry's right. And you know what? We do have that Constitution, and it does mean something.
It does say that. Yeah, it does say that. Yeah.
Yeah,
he does have that right. Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to ask about, I hate it when people say on these I have very firm opinions about podcasts. When there's a very prominent podcast that I love. I'm not going to say what it is because I love it so much. I do actually love this podcast. It's a great podcast, but the guy for years and years and years said, let me ask you this question. Instead of just asking the question, he would, I'm not kidding. He would say, let me ask you this. I'm going to ask you this. And he does it over and over again, but it's such a great podcast over the years that, you just kind of like,
you tolerate it in a way. But
I almost did that. And I was kicking myself.
It's perfect.
But,
so one thing on this real quick, Lucas, he was taught by a guy, Robert Goldwin, who was a University of Chicago educated political philosopher. And Robert Goldwin was a connection to one of someone in our lineage a little bit further back, Lucas, like Leo Strauss. So Leo Strauss taught Robert Goldwin about the Federalist Papers, about John Locke. And then Goldwin got connected with a guy by the name of Don Rumsfeld in Chicago, because Rumsfeld was from Chicago. The two of them became friends. And Robert Goldwin, a professor at Kenyon College, got really tied in with Rumsfeld and followed him around. And when Rumsfeld joined Gerald Ford, Ford brought in Robert Goldwin. So he had an in-house sort of Straussian constitutionalist teaching Gerald Ford about Alexander Hamilton and Hamiltonian presidencies. And in Robert Goldwin's notes, I was able to line up a meeting that Goldwin and Richard Cheney, Dick Cheney, future vice president, had with Ford on like a Sunday afternoon, teaching Ford about the veto. And so Robert Goldwin has a marked up copy of Fed 73, and he walks in to the White House, and we have it on the call logs and the meeting logs to show that the president spent a considerable amount of time with Robert Goldwin talking through Hamilton's design for the veto. And Ford vetoed more. He's like the fourth all time in terms of rate of vetoes. Like he issued a ton of vetoes during his time, right? He had an oppositional Democratic Congress. And so Ford was getting hammered in the press. And so Goldwin's suggestion to Cheney and Rumsfeld, who had Ford's ear, was, let me talk to him and let's see if there's some way we can borrow Alexander Hamilton's logic and defend the veto and say, look, this isn't President No stuff. I'm not just blocking you for my health, right? I want you to do a better deliberative job at developing good legislation. And so that was my best. That was like the best day. I had the double steak at Denny's that night, right? I had the whole thing. I had the dessert.
You had the chicken fried steak.
Really good. Yeah. It was
You're like, you know what?
Day.
Put some extra gravy on that.
Yeah.
Is it this guy?
Right. Is this Robert? Yeah, the Parchment. Yeah, from Parchment to Power.
It's the same guy.
Same guy. Yeah. And there's a ton of stuff.
This is another Uhlmann book. He required us to read this. I can't remember for which class, but
they were old battle buddies in different ways.
No kidding. That's a good book.
Robert Goldwin. Yeah, it's a great book. Goldwin wrote a lot for AEI. So if folks want to go bum around AEI, there's all sorts of stuff that Robert Goldwin wrote for the American Enterprise Institute.
How cool is that?
But it's all on this constitutional stuff. And really, really a neat guy. But saved, I think, if I was to sort of trace the kind of pattern, Ford, Robert Goldwyn's connection to Ford,
Mhm.
may have saved some of the constitutionalism and made the constitutionalism more prominent in Ford's thinking that he then internalized and talked
No
about.
kidding. Yeah,
Yeah,
I've looked at this book quite a bit, and I never knew much about the guy, but I could
yeah,
tell that he spent a lot of time. I did not know he was a student of Leo Strauss until just now.
yeah. No, a really
So yeah,
fascinating
it's
guy.
a good book.
Yeah,
So what did Ford think about the proposal for um an independent counsel,
yeah.
not the special prosecutor that Nixon kept firing, but the independent counsel statute? Did he sign that into law?
Yeah, he did not. He did not. That would
Okay.
later come under the Carter administration, as I recall, I think. The independent counsel law, they fought pretty heavy.
Okay. So
Um,
that's very interesting to me
yeah,
because he takes power on the resignation of Nixon, and then pretty soon after that, isn't it festering in Congress, this idea that there should be an independent counsel in the executive branch?
yeah, almost
Well,
immediately,
I
right?
would imagine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're already talking about this, right? So you have that Saturday Night Massacre in
Right.
73. And the idea that a president can fire the people that are investigating executive malfeasance, they're like, come on. Like Congress is like, clearly this is bad. We need a way of protecting and insulating um,
Hmm.
that from political meddling. And so
Yeah.
they propose it, right? And then Scalia, this is where I think when you understand Antonin Scalia's jurisprudence that kind of emerges later,
Mm.
I think all of his views on the separation of powers and the executive congressional relations really get cauterized, like really kind of put together in the Ford White House. I think when you can tie a line to some of these guys, right? So Scalia, Richard Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, their views on executive power were formed in the Ford administration when these guys were getting hit all the time by congressional subpoenas, this constant kind of barrage from Congress, well
Gotcha.
intentioned, right? Trying to reform what
Sure.
they feared was a problem with the White House. But
Yeah.
those guys felt embattled. And when
Yeah.
you get to later on, you get a much more militant presidency that maybe
Yeah.
it was a different time that formed their minds. Um,
Yeah.
Sorry, that took a
That's
path down a
insightful.
rabbit hole that I didn't know I was going down there.
No, no,
But
that's a very insightful bridge to other Republican administrations because
yeah,
they are, prominent people, Rumsfeld and Cheney, both.
yeah, yeah,
I'm trying to remember who was who was the defense secretary twice? Was it Rumsfeld?
yeah. So right before the election, they moved out James Schlesinger, who was the holdover from Nixon, and
Hmm.
Ford wanted somebody that could really go to town in the Pentagon. And so
Okay.
Ford sent Don Rumsfeld to defense to fill in. And so he became the youngest defense secretary. And then he
Okay.
became the oldest defense secretary. So he eventually left the White House and went over to,
Gotcha. So he
uh,
had spent some time in Congress, so he knew some of the game over there.
yeah,
He
yeah.
knew
And
what you're supposed to say.
yeah, that's right. And I think he had some
Yeah.
experience being like, he was in executive leadership positions. I think he was like the Searle company and like the people that makes, I think it's Splenda, I think the Splenda
Really?
company. So
Okay.
he had some business acumen that made the Pentagon kind of a good
Yeah.
place for kind of a CEO type.
And then Cheney was
His understudy.
H.W. Bush. Okay. So
That's
then
right.
he was later he was later defense secretary under the first Bush. Is
That's
that
right.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
And
right.
then vice president under George W. Bush.
You got it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so this is a huge. Now, what you said about Scalia was interesting because Scalia is serving under Ford in the Justice Department high up, along
Yeah.
with our
Office of
former,
Legal Counsel. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
along with our former Professor Uhlmann.
Right.
And Scalia, we're talking about the independent counsel statute that eventually passed,
Yeah.
signed into to law by probably a Democrat
I think it's
president. Is that right?
I think it's Carter. Yeah.
Carter. That sounds
Yeah.
right. I don't think Reagan would have signed it into law, but maybe.
No, they tried to fight it. That's that
Okay.
Morrison v. Olson case that
Yeah.
comes up later.
But see,
Yeah.
that's the link with Scalia, is Scalia is so famous for writing that dissent, which is a beautiful dissent in
It's
Morrison
amazing.
versus Olson. So everybody drop what you're doing, put your cereal down, because I know you're eating cereal in the early morning now. Just put the cereal down and just go to Google Scholar and look up Morrison versus Olson on
Yeah.
this. And I don't think I had ever put that together until right now, that it would have been Morrison versus Olson
Yeah.
that was written by a Ford guy,
Yeah.
a
That
Ford
dissent.
guy.
Yeah.
So if you go to Google Scholar, I'm just going to show the students
Sure.
how to
No,
do this.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Get the legit thing. Don't go to Wikipedia.
Yeah. Go the real deal. Yeah. If you're going to do
Case
it.
law, federal court. I think the Supreme Court is federal, I think.
I think so.
And Morrison versus Olson,
Yeah.
1988. Look for 1988. There it is on the top.
This, what is
Shocker.
the line? What is the line there? This wolf comes as a wolf or something like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get cases that come as wolves in sheep's clothing, but
Oh,
this wolf
yeah.
comes as a wolf in the Scalia dissent. Yeah.
So you can just do a little search for dissent, and then you go right to the Scalia dissent. This is the best reading you're going to read on the presidency probably all
I
day,
think that's right.
and maybe all week.
I think that's right.
But yeah, the wolf quote. Let me do the search on the wolf
Sure.
quote. Yeah,
That's amazing.
this wolf comes as a wolf.
Wolves in sheep's clothing.
Look how short that sentence is, and how. But
Punchy.
Scalia worked for Ford. I totally didn't connect that until just now. And then Ford is coming in right as the independent counsel statute is like all the rage
Right
because
there.
of Nixon. That's very interesting.
So they had to push all of this off, right? And so Uhlmann, Scalia, Edward Levy is the guy who was a Democrat, but like a law and order Democrat of an old sort in
Okay.
Chicago. And he was the AG, the attorney general that sort of oversaw Scalia, Bork. It's like a King Arthur's court, I think. When you line up those guys, right?
Yeah.
You've got these great sort of scions of kind of American conservative jurisprudence that all sort of rotated around that Ed Levy kind of schoolmaster place on the seventh floor of the Justice Department. And then they go on to have these distinguished legal careers. But I think that crucible, they always felt like Congress was trying to take them out. And so they always were like, you know what, we got to fend off the independent counsel. There was an effort to write a detailed statutory charter for the FBI. Maybe that might be a good thing today. Maybe we could benefit from very clear guidelines, right, on the FBI.
Maybe.
But it narrows executive discretion in a lot of ways, right? And so that was why these guys said, no, we need to have the freedom to do what the country requires. And if Congress makes that too difficult, everybody's worse for it. And so they tried to push some of that off a little bit.
So now we're going to take a look at your table of contents here.
Sure.
The national nightmare is over. Basically, what you're saying there is Ford makes everybody feel hunky dory for a little while.
But it's kind of a misnomer, actually, that title. My editor and I, we kind of talked about this. It's like, well, you got to deal with the pardon or something, right?
Yeah.
And so they go
right away.
And they say the reality of it is it's a nightmare sort of over. There was a question mark. Is it actually over? Because all of those economic problems, Vietnam, all of that crushing in on Ford. So he said it before he believed it in a way. Yeah.
So we talked about the veto and the commander-in-chief power. Whatever happened with the Mayaguez, what was the resolution of that?
So Ford was able to successfully retake the freighter. They recaptured the freighter.
Easily, or did people die?
Some Marines lost their lives.
Okay, that's what Pius was making a big deal of. I think that's what Richard Pius was complaining about. If I'm not.
And I mean, it's one of those things that maybe, and so part of the part is where the lives were lost, if I recall this correctly, where the lives were lost was part of the show of force element, like the punishing the Khmer Rouge that took the freighter.
Okay.
And so maybe there was some question about whether, that degree of military intervention was absolutely necessary. And I think that might be probably where Pius is kind of critiquing it a little bit, if I had to guess. But I'll have to
Okay.
read his book. I have to look at his book now. You turned me on to this, so this is good.
Yeah, that would be a great um,
Giving me
foil
an idea
for.
on another publication, so that's good, Lucas. This is the stuff I
Yeah,
need, so
yeah,
that's
yeah.
huge.
That would be great foil for your students too. If you're
Yeah,
teaching a class on this, then
really,
have them look at what Pius says and what you say about this.
it's
Um,
huge.
Spy master and chief in the intelligence community. It's been a while
Yeah,
since I've looked at that. Remind us what that's all
that's
about. It seems
okay.
like there
So
was a lot of
yeah,
stuff going on with the CIA and all the sorts of the
yeah. No,
congressional
it's
investigations.
yeah, it's wild. So in December of 74, like literally right at, they're still figuring out how the phones work in the White House, right? Seymour Hersh, the guy who runs the New York Times or wrote for an investigator for the New York Times, writes this giant expose. He wrote about the My Lai massacre. And so he kind of cut his teeth on sort of exposing government corruption and exposing cover ups. So there was a little bit of a questionable human rights thing with a US unit in Vietnam. And so he got like all sorts of accolades for that. But
Yeah.
his next iteration in December of 74 is he comes out with this massive kind of expose of everything the CIA has ever done wrong. And he says there's a report that exists that shows all of these things that the CIA has done wrong. And
Wow.
instantly the press snaps back into that Watergate frenzy.
Right.
It's like chumming the water, like Shark Week or whatever, right? They just chum the water up. And then everybody starts trying to say, well, the CIA is corrupt, all of these things, look at what they're doing. And Ford had to figure out how to keep some things secret that we needed to keep secret. Like we're still fighting the Cold War and we still have guys in Vietnam. And at the
Yeah.
same time, comply with all of these congressional requests to get rid of the
Yeah.
bad stuff.
What? Yeah. Exactly. How is Congress a pain in the executive branch? Maybe we need to state exactly what that is. Is it the document
Sure. So
requests? Is it just the
yeah, so this is
nitpicky,
the
constant
yeah.
request for information?
Yeah, they asked for the whole, like the background of all of this, right? So they asked the executive branch. So, and they were requiring officials to testify
Yeah.
to particular
Under oath.
operations under oath that the
Yeah.
CIA had conducted,
This is not
assassination
like an
attempts.
informal meeting with your boss. This is not
This is a
like
real deal.
this is
Yeah,
can imagine like your chair emails you about a student like there we need to talk to you about Missy and her D plus.
right.
Imagine getting called in and now you're like taking you're under oath.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
you
on a
know
green felted desk. All the desks
right.
at the time had this green tablecloth. They've changed it now. But these guys talked about being behind a green felted desk. Like,
Well,
this is my nightmare.
okay,
And
let's
so,
press into this a little bit. Like, okay, for
sure.
someone in the executive branch, why is this? Because some people might think, what's that a big deal? You just go in there and you tell them what happened. What's a big
Tell
deal?
them what you did. Yeah. Well, the really dangerous
Takes a
part
lot
of
of
it,
time.
and yeah, it takes a ton of time.
You're
As
trying to run the government. You're in the middle of stuff, and
yeah,
you have to go over there, and it's like this committee of people that don't really even know what's going on, and they're asking you stuff that like it's just for their political career, basically.
and that's what I was going to say. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
They're just posturing, right? And so you have several senators. So Frank Church was the head of the Church
Yeah,
Committee.
sure. Yeah,
If you're into looking up Frank Church and the Church Report, he
yeah,
was all about running for president. And so he was a senator from Idaho, and he's trying to build his brand as being a serious fighter, taking on government corruption. You could write the ad, right? And so he's trying to prove that the CIA is out of control and your Congress is on the job.
right.
And so they just literally request a bunch of documents about, you know, how does the CIA approve things? Is the CIA subject to democratic control? Are they
Mhm.
just sort of a rogue elephant running wild
Yeah.
without any presidential control? And what the Republicans did that was wise
Hmm.
is they said, if you're going to look at Richard Nixon, let's look at what Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson did. And they wound the clock back. And so politically, as a political strategy, and this is all through their deliberations, right? As a political strategy, by broadening the scope to say, if we're going to look at the CIA, let's look at the whole history of the CIA. And from that, right, they got a more full picture of how, for the most part, Congress had been asleep at the switch and just said, whatever you guys want to do, you do it. And so by flipping the tables on Congress, they were able to kind of avoid some of that. At the time,
interesting.
Yeah, at the time there was an ambassador, a U.S. ambassador or diplomat that was killed in Greece, Richard Welch. And he was killed for an unrelated reason, but the Ford people ran with that. And they said, look, this is what happens when people reveal secrets
Right.
that hurt people abroad.
Yeah.
And they released his like home address, and some I think it was the Intercept released it or something. And then they showed up at his house, and these Greek revolutionaries killed Richard Welch. And Ford said, you know what, we're never letting a Richard Welch happen again. We're going to write an executive order that fixes things so members of Congress can be satisfied that the presidency has healed itself, right? And so he came out and wrote an executive order. I think it was 11905, and it lasted until the reforms after 9/11. So it was
and
the longest.
That had to do with protecting classification to Congress or something like that.
Yeah. So it
Classified
set up.
material.
Yeah. So it set up these oversight boards.
Okay.
That were kind of not really kind of part of the machine of the CIA, but they had enough people on them that congressmen could feel comfortable, relying on their word and things like that.
Would they testify? Okay, so the congressmen, they wouldn't get the stuff itself. They would have to just ask these guys about it.
So there were ways there were oversight. So it clarified. I mean, there was a whole bunch of stuff about reporting requirements that were outlined in it.
Right.
So Senate intelligence, House intelligence. So they had standing committees that emerged out of these investigations.
They could see the actual stuff.
They could go
in camera or something.
Right. With like one of those special tents that they go into, like they call it a skiff, and they can look at all those materials. But that plan that Ford came out with was an example of how the Constitution allows a president a lot of options to centralize reforms and say, well, you guys are chattering classes about this and getting distracted about the 76 election. I'm actually going to take charge of my own house here and set it in order. Are you guys okay with this? And they weren't entirely happy, but it took the air out of the sails of those intelligence investigations in a big way.
So Ford basically said, I'm going to protect classified information. We're going to ratchet down accountability and also do something to throw these Congress people a bone.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
I think that's right. We're going to give them reforms that we can live with. Okay. And in this sense, right, it's that good marriage model he had. He said, but it doesn't mean he has to follow their lead.
Right.
And I think that's the most interesting part of it.
Yeah.
It's when he acts and leans in on something and takes charge and takes responsibility that the members of Congress aren't as opposed to you once you kind of move in that direction.
That's a nicer way to say it than the way I said it, because Congress is a human being on the marriage analogy, whereas I'm thinking of a dog that just won't shut up.
Well, there's that too.
And the only way you can get him to shut up is to get that Outback Steakhouse, or the Lucille's barbecue out of the freezer and throw it.
Right. There. Send that rib over there.
Keep him busy over there for 20 minutes.
Right.
That's interesting. Yeah. So you got this last chapter that's substantive.
Yeah.
Besides the conclusion, not that the conclusion's not substantive.
No, I know what you mean.
The take care clause, and legislative encroachments. We've talked a little bit about legislative encroachments, but what does Gerald Ford particularly stand out? What stands out about him on the take care clause?
Yeah, so this one's the really cool one. So the in
So
terms of
really
high
cool.
constitutional. Yeah, this is a really cool one. I mean, it's kind of
Okay.
nerd stuff and it's kind of intricate a little bit, but it relates to the INS v. Chadha decision that would
Oh
later
man,
come up
that's
under
really,
under Reagan.
yeah, that's really nerdy.
Yeah, so it's super nerdy. So this is an idea that Congress can pass a delegation of authority to the president. Like we're gonna like I don't know if you think about the military construction and the Trump border wall, right?
Mhm.
Congress provides a piece of legislation to
Right,
the president that allows him to do certain things on delegated authority, right?
right,
Well,
right.
the deal is to
Yeah,
get the delegation, Congress reserves the rights to continue your dog analogy a little bit, to
yeah.
jerk the president's leash back, right?
Now the president
So
is the
treating the
dog.
president as a dog, right? Yeah.
So we're
So
switching
so
the
the
analogy a little
legislature,
bit.
yeah, I know
Yeah,
I've flipped it around there, yeah. But pulling the leash back on the executive. So encourage the
right.
executive to take a politically hard decision, like in this case, they were talking about um
So it's a
changing there was
legislative veto, in other words. Is
yeah,
that fair to say?
legislative veto. That's right. That's the correct term. Yeah.
Which is not in the Constitution.
No, not even at
Not
all.
explicitly, but I guess you could argue that it's something like it is there because they have the church, they have the power of the purse,
Yeah,
and they can.
yeah, and
What's to stop them from putting conditions on the money?
and
Okay, so
and changing that around. Yeah.
yeah, okay, so the border wall funds, or where I was trying to think of where you're going to go with that. The border wall funds come from a pot that was originally designated to something else, and but the
Yeah, for
president has,
military construction.
yeah, so the president has some kind of discretion about how to divvy that up.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay,
So the president is given the power by Congress. Because what do you think when you think of like,
right,
hey, we need to build we need to build a new post office or something like that. That's a
okay,
congressional power, right?
right.
So we give a little bit of power to the president and say Congress is not really sure what the president might need, so we're going to give him a little bit of discretion to do
Yeah,
what he thinks is best.
uh-huh.
Well, at the time, they liked doing this.
Seemed like a good idea at the time,
This seemed like a good idea at the
As
time.
Michael Uhlmann
That's
would say.
right.
It seemed like a good idea at the
That's
time.
right.
This is his
It was a good
explanation
idea at the
for any
time.
disaster that happens.
Everything. Yeah. Simplicity. What's the other one? Simplicity. When stupidity is the reason for the
Is
I
a
forget how it
sufficient
says it now.
explanation for the data.
Yeah.
No
You
further
don't need to look
recourse to
any
another
further.
explanation is necessary.
Yeah,
Yeah. He
it was
said it better
great.
than
It was
that, but
great
yeah.
lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're dead on. But this idea that if Congress gives power to the president and gives discretion to the president, what gives them the right to then, after the president goes out on a limb, to
Yeah.
say no, bad president, and pull him back? It's
Right.
this subordination of the president
Yeah.
that Ford rejected. And so what I look at in that chapter is pretty much all of the early efforts to think about a test case to take to the Supreme Court that would have,
Right.
been an early form of INS v. Chadha. And I think they were ready to go had they had the electoral mandate in 76. They
Okay.
might have tried to push a little bit more. Um, but this is where Scalia, who later was on the DC circuit for INS v.
Yeah.
Chadha. So there's some interesting movement there.
I've never read his. Did he write an opinion in that case?
I think he
Was he
was
on the
on
three
that.
judge panel?
I think he, or it was on, it might have been on the on bank. I don't know exactly.
It
I'll have
went
to
on
check
bank.
that out.
Okay. Hmm.
He might have been involved in there somewhere, but I believe he wasn't on the court yet. But they
No, that
borrowed,
was 1983.
yeah. So it was right around that time.
Okay.
And this whole test case
Mm-hmm.
was they had policy reasons. And so they were trying to figure out which legislative veto they would use to challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were looking around and they found some obscure provisions of the OMB, but they weren't sure how the Supreme Court would vote on it at the time. And so they said, we're not going to bring this test case right now. And later, the same people that were sort of floating around Ford later reinvigorated it under the INS v. Chadha stuff under Reagan. And so it kind of became a thing later. But that's what I look at. I look at the ways in which Ford tried to fight back against a
Yeah.
variety of kind of legislative encroachments and explored the idea of fighting a legislative veto. So that was kind of a catch-all chapter in a way. So I have a
Right.
little bit on legislative vetoes. I've got a little bit on the FBI charter and some
What
things.
what was the INSB Chatta about? You want to tell everybody about that
Sure,
briefly?
yeah. So that case is a great case. So there's a guy,
Yeah.
Chadha, who came and overstayed a student visa. Uh, and I think if I remember this correctly, the Justice Department wanted to, if I remember this correctly, they wanted to allow him to, I think they wanted to allow him to stay. I sometimes get this backwards. They wanted to allow him to stay, and Congress came in and said, no, you're going to push him out, or it was vice
Hmm.
versa. I forget the exact fact pattern, but the goal was for the test case was to get, and they knew that he was going to stay, and he had this story about he had a family here and all of this, right? So they wanted to let this immigrant alien stay in the United States. And so Congress changes the rules. They came up and changed the rules uh, on the president after the attorney general had come out. And there it is. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Now this is one I'm just curious. I have to figure out whether it was. I'll see
Well,
there. Yeah.
yeah, I'm gonna look down here and see. Maybe there's a DC circuit.
Yeah, I
Well,
don't
maybe I
think
don't know.
so. That says from the
Okay.
9th. So I may be mistaken on this a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
So
So the Ninth Circuit.
so
Okay.
yeah, but Rex Lee, Solicitor General Lee, Rex Lee,
Hmm.
uh, was part of that triumvirate of folks in the Justice Department at the time. Assistant Attorney General Ted Olson,
Hmm.
right? So that's Ted
Later
Olson of
from Olson Morrison versus
Morrison
Olson.
v. Olson.
Yeah. That's
So
interesting.
so Chadha was involved in this, and they invalidated. So this, as it says here, to invalidate the decision of the executive branch
Hmm.
pursuant to the authority delegated by Congress.
Right.
And so he overstays his visa, and then Congress effectively tries to change the decision that the attorney general made. So they allow him to stay, right? I think they allow him to stay. Well, did they come out? Lucas, this is
Yeah.
terrible. I
Yeah.
should know this.
It's been a while. It's been a while. Let me search conclusion. See
Sure.
what see if that helps. I might just skip
Let
down
me
to the
pull this
bottom.
up.
It's a long one.
I got it here too.
It's a long one. I remember printing this out and reading it. These are
I
challenging to
know,
read
and I should
because
be
you.
better on this.
Okay, here we got dissent. White was dissenting. Um, yeah, I think the
Yeah.
basic issue was I didn't know there was a dissent.
So
Okay, so it's right before the dissent.
I just checked it out, right? An
Mhm.
immigration, an immigration judge, so in the executive branch, decided to keep him. And the House said, no, you have to deport him. And so the idea that they would remove this from the sky, so it fits all of
Yeah,
the political narratives, right, that you
right.
want. And the general end of the day is the holding is that if you give a power over to the president, you can't reserve this power to kind of
Yeah,
second guess them.
you
And
can't
that's
phrase it in such a way. Congress, you're very creative. You're good at giving money with conditions, but you can't phrase it in such a way that you undermine separation of powers, which is
that's
another
right.
part of the
That's
Constitution.
beautiful. So this is
So,
why you got the Republican professor right here. This is
yeah,
perfect. This is
right.
great. This is great.
Yeah. Well, you got, yeah, it exceeded its scope. See, I think I remember this is why I was a little bit uneasy with how he put this. This is Berger. He
Yeah.
says, in my view, when Congress undertook to apply its rules to Chadha, it exceeded the scope of its constitutionally prescribed authority. So far, I'm like, yeah, yeah. And then I would not reach the broader question of whether legislative vetoes are invalid under the presentment clause. It's kind of like, I don't know. To me, it's sort of like
Weird.
saying Roe versus Wade. Yeah, this one lady can get an abortion. we're not going to reach the
Eh,
broader issue of whether other women can get an abortion.
yeah, it's
I don't know.
wild. Yeah,
Maybe it's
no.
disanalogous. Probably
No,
disanalogous
no. I
somehow.
mean,
But
there's something there, right? I mean, they write in so many weird ways and they want to have their cake and eat it too. And so they try to,
so White liked. Speaking of abortion, he dissented in Roe versus Wade, and he likes the legislative veto. I'm going to have to look this up.
yeah.
Maybe.
Oh,
I'm
no.
now. I'm going to have to look this up again.
So he was yeah, yeah. It's such a weird case, but it's a great case in a lot of ways. I think it teaches a lot about that kind of ways
So,
in which members of Congress drive, like you say, they're creative authors, right? And so it
so,
violated the presentment clause. Their
so
argument.
Alex, you've been teaching for a while now. What kind of courses do you teach there?
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate here. I wrote on Ford, but I get to teach on con law. So I do
Oh, that's
all of
cool.
the constitutional law cases, which why I'm a little embarrassed about the sketchy on INS Vichada, but we'll figure it out. It's a
That's all right.
learning process. I'm in a learning process here.
Yeah.
The the so I teach con law one, which is national powers, which is most of this separation of powers type stuff.
Right.
So how the branches interact, congressional um, qualifications,
Mhm.
those types of things. And then I do my other upper division course. I do con law two, which is Bill of Rights, civil
Oh, how
rights.
cool is that?
Yeah, it's a great job. I'm the luckiest guy in the world.
Man.
And then the third course, I do a law, politics, and society course. And that one's a little amorphous. And so I get to do a lot of cats and dogs in there. But lately, I've been really into looking at the opioid epidemic a little bit and
Okay.
trying to think about um, kind of side effects of law. So when you pass a law, you say, hey, we're going to restrict the ability of pharmacies to prescribe pills for people for pain. Well, if you do that and you don't treat the underlying addiction, where do
Mhm.
those people go but into black tar heroin and that type of so what are the ways in which the law impacts society and how does society react to those laws a little bit? And so we play around with that. And it's a little bit of
Do
criminal
you
procedure and stuff too.
do you teach every year these con law courses, or is it every other year?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate here that I'm relatively stable. So every year I do con law one in the spring and then con law two
Wow.
or con law one in the fall and con law two in the spring.
What time of
And
day are they? Are they always at the same time?
yeah. No, they vary up a little bit,
Okay.
unfortunately. So it depends on the year. But then I also have my intro American obligations too. So
Okay.
I
You have
do,
intro.
yeah. So I teach a lot of intro civics.
What
Um,
what's your teaching load?
so it's technically a 3-2. So I'll
Three,
do
two.
I
Wow.
know it's like a dream. It's like a dream. I
And
remember I
and you have to
remember
teach
the
five in the summer, right?
yeah,
That's
yes,
the catch.
17, right? Yeah. No, it's a nice thing to be able to do that.
Three,
The other
two.
part of it that I didn't anticipate, which is the wild part, in a liberal arts college, um, the amount of I'm fortunate in a lot of ways because I get to work with a lot of students. I have about 40 advisees typically. And so we see those folks twice a year at least, and then whenever they're failing a course or whatever. So I
Mhm.
really get a cool chance to see some kids who are, have the right intention, but maybe don't have it all together yet or something like that. And we can really do good work. I do my best work one-on-one, I've discovered. And getting the chance to do this with you, Lucas, and get to talk to your
Yeah.
audience and get to talk to people. I mean, this is what I think you and I came from a similar place. Like if we're not
Yeah.
teaching, it doesn't
Oh
like
yeah.
why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Like
Me
what are
too.
we
Yeah.
doing?
It's really cool to see that there's still a place where education might still happen here and there.
There's
It-
I have my moments. Ask me tomorrow. I might have a completely different answer for you about
Is
it.
that the school that Clarence Thomas went to, or is it a
Yeah,
different?
it's
It is.
really amazing. Yeah. So this was Clarence
Clarence
Thomas's
Thomas went there.
undergraduate.
No way.
There's a tree that I can see right out here. So we have an arboretum, which is a cool New England thing where we plant all these different trees. There's the Clarence Thomas tree outside my window, which is
Wow.
really cool.
That is
Um,
really awesome, man. Holy
yeah,
cow.
it's really cool. The problem is
Wow.
that for obvious reasons, being a liberal arts college in New England, politically there are some pressures that make them somewhat skeptical at times of him, which is really kind of unfortunate in a lot of ways. He's our most prominent. I mean, when you think about it, like
Yeah.
he's our most prominent
Something
alum.
tells me you're you're leaving some things out in that description.
Yeah,
But yeah,
no,
you're being very kind, I think, in that description.
sure.
You're being very congenial.
Yeah,
That I mean, I'm so jazzed for you
it's really a great place.
because I'm such a huge fan of Clarence Thomas. I used to be a bigger fan, but then I lost all this weight. I used to be huge.
Huge.
You got that right away. I didn't even have to explain it.
That's fantastic, Lucas. That's
There's been
good.
so many people that just looked at me like, huh?
What?
What? And then I
No,
just
it's
tell them to
good.
look up the word big in the dictionary. And then I say, no, you know what? Never mind. Never mind.
No.
Well,
It's great. I mean, it's a really good run of folks. I'm fortunate here, and I'm anything
so
that
do you have to write books to keep
yeah.
your
So
job?
I have to write a ton. So that's what
Okay.
I'm in the throes of at the moment. I'm
So you
working on
have
a
to write to in the summer.
yeah. We write well. Even then, I'm writing, trying to have stuff in the hopper almost all the time. So that's the trade.
Gotcha.
But
They
we'll get
want
there.
journals. They want books. What do they want?
They want some journals. They want yeah, any of the above, any and all of the above. Peer reviewed is the key. So they want
So not law
um
review journals.
yeah, no, they're actually encouraging me. We have a list of places that are target lists. And so I'm hopeful. I'm working through some of them on some of the
Okay.
projects I'm working on and stuff. So I got one on declare war, right? Kind of
Oh,
president
cool.
veto a war declaration. And my argument is, yeah, I mean, it's just like any other pice of law. So why can't a president veto a war declaration?
Oh, that's
So
interesting. I
there's
don't think
some
I've
cool
ever thought
stuff
about
that I
that.
get to do. Yeah. So it's really neat that way.
Now, what's the summer like? Is it really hot and is it cold in the winter?
Yeah, so it's balmy here for a guy coming from California. So this was the weird thing. So I lived in California for a little while and then I moved here. And humidity here is a whole nother thing. I'm convinced everyone here just lives in water. It's either frozen water,
Yeah.
snow, right? Water in the air. Like
Yep.
it's just constant moisture. It's green, it's beautiful. We got great foliage right now, so it's pretty awesome
Are there
in
really
that
good
regard.
bird songs? Do they have
I
bird?
I
They have,
haven't, yeah, they have good ones, good birds, but I haven't mastered any of them yet. So
yeah. So you walk out in the spring and you're like, there's the good bird song. That's
yeah,
why I'm here. Because
yeah, that's
we have
right.
stupid bird songs down in California. I mean, they're just the
Really.
same little stupid bird songs. But but the East Coast, oh, the bird songs, I can't imagine.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for spending, gosh, 2 hours with us on
Blew
Gerald
by for me.
Ford and separation of powers.
Uh,
Ah,
I know,
man,
right?
mind
Crazy.
blown. I really
So
learned a lot
awesome.
from you, and you are clearly a master of this material.
Thank you,
And
my
when you
friend.
read through the book, which I have, I enjoy all the little anecdotes, and I especially love that you back up everything from archival research that you personally looked at. Um, so you are a classic scholar kind of a guy.
I appreciate that, Lucas.
Yeah,
It
you
means a
do it the
lot.
right way.
It means a
Yeah,
lot. When I look through your list of guests, I mean, this is one of the great honors is to get
yeah,
included and get to talk. I mean, if you
yeah.
work through your whole archive, you have some
I know.
amazing people you've had come and talk to you. And it's just so neat that
It's
you're putting it
amazing.
in a format, right?
Yeah,
That people can actually access while they're driving around or sitting on the freeway or whatever. I mean,
yeah.
it's just amazing. It's really slick. So I'm
Thanks.
really honored. I'm really
Yeah,
honored.
I have a vision for this as like an archivist. I want to put some stuff out there that lasts for decades. And
Yeah,
so that's kind of the challenge for me is with podcasts these days, there's certain folks that just want to stay on kind of the cutting edge of whatever people are talking about
sure.
now. And there's a panic that you're going to lose people's attention, and
Yeah,
especially if you're trying to monetize it,
sure.
it's really, I think, harmful for the kind of work that you and I do, which is more careful and more
Sure.
perspicuous for the future. Like what
Yeah.
people are going to look back on, for example, Trump,
Yeah.
and they're not going to have memory of it. They're not going to be able to draw from their personal memory of it to check they're not going to have a BS detector on certain things.
I think that's
And
right.
so they're going to, I'm just giving you an example. I mean, obviously it could be any other topic, but
Sure.
they're just going to piece together whatever they have. And I think that's how it is with Nixon and Ford too. Like you
Yep.
look back, and I don't have memory of that, you know.
Yeah.
I don't. So
Yeah.
I just go by what people say. The professors say, what are they saying? What, and it could be a disaster what they're saying. And it's nice to have a kind of a presentation of trustworthy voices that are talking about all sorts of different topics.
No, it's
And
great.
so I'm hoping that in the future people don't look back at Republicans and think, well, they were all a bunch of crazy
Crazies. Yeah.
people.
Right.
No, actually, there's quite a bit going on.
And there's
So,
more thoughtfulness than people give people credit for. And only by
yeah,
doing what we just did, Lucas, like this long format,
yep,
can you actually
can't do
kind
it
of
fast.
unpack this stuff. And that's the part that's the beautiful thing. So
You
I'm
can't script it.
100% behind you. Yeah, no, this is
Yeah,
awesome.
you
This
got
is
to have
awesome.
it's got to be genuine. I appreciate that a
Yeah, for
lot.
sure.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, for sure. We'll see you soon, Lucas, for sure.
Okay.